All right, I think we'll start then if it doesn't look like there's any additional people being added. Okay. Um, all right, so I'd like to welcome everyone to the Biological Data Standards Cluster presentation on using GitHub for collaborative review of the Biological Data Primer Guidelines. So first, I'll give an overview of our agenda for today. We're going to start with some introductions, and then we'll give an overview of the primer that's been developed and the guidelines that we're currently working on. Then we'll have an overview of GitHub, and then end with a GitHub demo and activity. So first, I'd like to do some introductions of the co-leads. My name's Kyla, and I'm a physical scientist for the U.S. Geological Survey, and I'll hand it over to Laura.
Hi, everybody. My name is Laura Brinskelly. I'm a contractor with NOAA's U.S. Integrated Ocean Observing System and a co-chair of the Biological Data Standards Cluster. I'll pass it off to Tim.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tim Vanderstap. I'm a scientific data specialist with the Haka Institute located here in Camel River on Vancouver Island. I help out with anything data management and data mobilization related within the institution, focused primarily on biological data. So this cluster is great for me. I'll pass it on to Steve.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So I'm Steve Formel. I use he, his pronouns. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey. I work remotely in New Orleans, where it's very snowy right now. I am a biologist, but a big part of my job is being the U.S. node manager for the Global Biodiversity Information Facility and the Ocean Biodiversity Information System, so two international initiatives to coordinate biodiversity data. I came into this group sort of via my predecessor, Abby Benson, who helped start it, and it's an awesome group to be part of. So I'm very excited what we got going on here and what we're going to work on today. I'm not sure who's next. Kylie, you want to?
And then last will be Kelsey.
Thank you, Kyla. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelsey Hulsman. I use she, her pronouns. I am an intern at the USGS and work very closely with Steve Formel, who just introduced himself, mostly doing work with GBIF and analyzing biodiversity data. I have a PhD from the University of Virginia in environmental science and am newish to the data standards world, but it's very fun and I really like it. And I think it's really important work. So I'm really excited to be this year's community fellow with this cluster. And I think that's everything. I will send it back to Kyla.
All right, great. So next we have just a Slido poll to get an idea of how familiar people are with GitHub. So if you could scan this code or use the link that will be in the chat to answer this question, we would appreciate that. Okay, looks like most people have answered that, and that generally the consensus in this room is people are pretty intermediate, so that will be a good starting place for us. And now we are going to move into the overview of the primer that we have been developing and some background on the Biological Data Standards Cluster. So this cluster was formed in 2020 to address the inconsistencies regarding standards in biological data. The goal of the cluster was to create trainings, documentation, and a community around biological data so that we can maximize data relevance. There are several standards that exist for biological data, but there are different data, metadata, and taxonomic standards, which are often confusing for data managers and users in general to navigate. So our cluster thought that the biological data community could really benefit from guidance, and that led to the creation of our best practices document. And ultimately, the goal for all of this is to maximize data relevance to understand how biodiversity is changing over time. So maybe some people are familiar, but we have the Biological Data Standards Primer, and I'll put a link or maybe one of, I'll just put this link into the primer so you can explore it on your own, but I'll also be going through it. So the primer really emphasizes the importance of using data standards to enhance data usability, interoperability, and the compliance with FAIR principles, or findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The primer is set up for data managers or perhaps someone who's new to the data management field and are asking various questions about biological data. So the first section focuses on the importance of using data standards to ensure our data is understandable. We provide an overview of commonly used standards for metadata like Darwin Core, Ecological Metadata Language, EML, Mixis, and we highlight that there are different repositories require different standards. This context is what makes data reusable both for us and other researchers who might need to interpret it. Another key benefit of using standards is data integration. By following standards such as Darwin Core, we make it possible to combine data from different sources. So this is important for large-scale studies and collaborative projects where data from multiple organizations need to be synthesized. And platforms like GBIF rely on standardized data to bring together biodiversity data from all around the world. Next is interoperability. It means structuring our data so it's compatible with other systems, especially automated tools and other data sets. So this can be done using controlled vocabularies, and taxonomic authorities are another way that we make data clear and consistent. Using standardized terms like those from ENVO or worms for marine species keeps everyone kind of on the same page. And this standardization is particularly valuable when data come from different studies and need to be merged. It makes collaboration and automated processing a lot easier. The next section, making data internet ready, ensures that the data can be shared and accessed programmatically online. So this involves structuring data in ways that repositories and services recognize it. Following standards required by repositories like DataOne help to make our data accessible to wider audiences, including researchers and automated systems, and it essentially opens the data for online use. The last section is making the data software ready. So data that are organized in tidy or long format are easier to work with in software like R and Python. And an example of this is using ISO 8601 for dates and formatting coordinates in decimal degrees. This is a universally understood format. And this kind of organization reduces the time spent reformatting data so researchers can dive right into analyses. And this result will improve efficiency. Oops. And then, so the primer can be used as a resource, but it doesn't provide the context data managers need to help decide which standards should be used for their data. This is why our group has been creating the guides as a sort of bridge between the primer document. And I will show the first guide that we created for the Make Your Data Software Ready section. So I'll put a link, or we'll be working on this after. So I'll just give a brief overview of what these guides look like. So the first section we're working on, like I said, is Make Your Data Software Ready. And so we've been using GitHub to develop these guides, and each guide is structured in the same way with an explanation and some definitions and key information along with some references we used. And so we'll be exploring this later with Laura and Steve. And now I will turn it over to Tim.
Excellent. Thank you, Kyla. So yeah, so one of the ways in which we're hoping to collect feedback on our primer guidelines is through GitHub. Just having a quick look at the results of that poll, it seemed like most people are fairly familiar with GitHub. So the next couple of slides might be just like repetition. It might be, you know, content that you already are familiar with. If not, that's great. Hopefully it can still be of use to others, perhaps seeing this video at a later stage as well. So GitHub really is a great open source cloud-based platform that is built around Git. Git itself is the version control system that's being used within GitHub, for example. And so if nothing else, really, I hope that one of the takeaways from today's meeting is that GitHub really is a great platform for storing plain text files and code, as well as being a great platform to collaborate on with project partners. And I would consider myself probably testimony to the fact that anyone can learn and use GitHub. Like I never learned it in university, and I only started using it a couple of years ago. And right now, I would say it's pretty much something I would use on a daily basis. So hopefully that tells you enough as to how relatively straightforward most of the fairly basic functionality of GitHub is. Obviously, another great feature of it is that it's free to use. So anyone's able to sign up and create an account. But in the next couple of slides, I just want to elaborate on a few key concepts of GitHub. And then I guess Laura will provide a little bit more of a more practical demonstration, as it were. First, though, I guess a brief explanation is perhaps needed on the kind of the difference between what is Git and what is GitHub. As said, Git really is the version control system. I like to kind of think of it in this way, where with Microsoft Word, you have like the edit and the undo button. Git kind of does that as well. And it helps create like a version for every change that has been made by any member of the project. And so, so in that way, it's a great way to kind of version control your project over time. It can also help track changes, and you can add any comments to any of the commits that I'll touch on in a little bit as well, explaining why you made the change. And as said, like it's great for both plain text files and for code, and can be done by multiple collaborators at the same time as well. On the other hand, you have GitHub. And so GitHub really is the platform that's built around Git, and that lets you store code and text files in what are called repositories. So we'll dive into that one next. So the next slide, please. So repositories are really I guess the basic elements, the bones of GitHub. They are practically like a big cloud-based folder, and it's the place where you would store your code and your files. And so, as I mentioned, GitHub really is a collaborative platform. So each repository can have multiple collaborators on it with various permissions as well. Each repository themselves can be either private, so just for you and your collaborators, or it can be publicly accessible and available to everyone. Each repository consists of at least like the main branch, or what some might call the master branch as well. But it is possible within GitHub to create additional branches that kind of run parallel to the main branch. So what exactly are these branches? When you create a branch, you can make any changes that you'd like to either text files or to code, within that branch without affecting necessarily the main branch. And then in time, whenever you're happy with the changes that you've made, you can propose to merge those changes from that branch that you've created back into the main branch through a pull, what we call a pull request, and that's something that we'll touch on as well. So this workflow itself, this is quite neat because it allows others to see what the changes are that you've made. They can review it, they can comment on it. There are certain checks that you can put in place through GitHub to see whether or not the code or any changes that you've made can actually properly merge into the master branch. But also it allows you to kind of revert back to previous versions if, for whatever reason, you do end up breaking anything in your main branch. All of this really is to say that there's, and I feel that might be the case with a lot of things, software and technical. There's a lot of layers to Git and GitHub, and it's very easy to kind of dive into it and get lost. Trust me, I've been there. I feel like the basic functionality is, and that's, I think, one of the key messages I'm hoping for you to take away is that the basic functionality hopefully is relatively intuitive with a little bit of learning, a little bit of time. There's definitely lots of layers to this, and you can get quite complex quite quickly. If you are interested in the world of GitHub and in Git itself, I'd recommend reading some documentation like what I've linked here. Next slide, please. So if you're familiar with GitHub, then you probably have also heard about forking a repository and cloning a repository. I feel like these are terms that are often kind of mixed and not always used consistently. The main difference between forking and cloning is really with regards to the ownership and the location of the repository. So when you fork a repository, essentially what you do is you create a new repository that has all of the same contents as the original repository, but it's now stored under your account. So this allows you to work independently on the contents within that forked repository. So any changes that you make will show up in the forked repository, but not necessarily in the original repository. Now, when you clone a repository, essentially what you're doing is you're creating like a linked local copy of that cloud-based repository, but then on your local machine. So if you have the right permissions, you can kind of push any changes that you've made back to the remote repository as well. So in this screenshot here, you can see, oh, nope, I changed that around. Sorry, I completely mixed this up. My bad. I'm gonna, can you go one slide further, please? Sorry, this is the one that I intended to show. My bad. So the content still remains the same. I'm just going to ask you to go back one when we come to the front. Ooh, this is poor on my behalf. I apologize, guys. The concepts of forking and cloning obviously remain the same. And what I wanted to show here is that here in the diagram, you can see that we have the BDS primary best practices that have been forked 3 times. Myself, I'm one of those people that have forked this repository. So in the bottom left, you see a diagram where ESIP is the owner of the primary best practices. And in the bottom right, you can see the forked best practices. So that is the exact same folder content and folder structure as is under the original repository, but then it's under my own account, as you can see there. In that case, can I ask you to go back one? Excellent. Thank you. So to save any changes that you've made, you can store them on your local machine by committing them. Essentially what this does is it saves changes to a copy of your repository to your local machine. But these changes will not show up yet within your cloud-based repository. So if you'd like those changes or those commits to show up in the cloud-based repository, for example, if you'd like, project collaborators to see exactly the progress that you've been making, you would have to make sure that you push those repository or those changes from your local machine to the cloud. Now, it is possible to push multiple commits at the same time. Personally, and I'd be curious to see what others would do, but personally what I do is I make several commits typically throughout the day, storing the progress and then kind of pushing them to the cloud at the end of the day. But I'm wondering if there's anybody out there that has a different or another preferred or best approach. Or is that typically what others do as well?
That's typically what I do also, but I guess I do try to be mindful of collaboration, right? Like if there's some critical thing that needs to happen before somebody else can pursue their work, I'll push that immediately. And but otherwise, yeah, I'll just sort of like use the commits as undo points where I'm saying, this was a like significant step in the process. So let me just mark that and then keep going. And yeah.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And thank you, Carl. I agree with that. Depends on the degree of interaction with collaborators. Most of the people that I collaborate with would be either with people that I see on a fairly regular basis, weekly or bi-weekly, or people within the institution themselves. So usually there's not really much of a time pressure or a time crunch to it, I'd say. Next slide, please. And then one further, as I hustled those up. All right, so pull requests. Especially, I think pull requests come into play when you have multiple people working on a single project or within a single repository. Because often when this happens, you'll want to make the changes or do your work either in a separate branch of the same repository or within like a fork that you created of that original. Is there a reason I'm muted? I just got a message that I'm muted. Can everybody hear me okay?
I can hear you
Yes.
now.
Yep, we can hear
Okay.
you now. You were momentarily muted, though.
Yeah.
Okay. What was the last bit that you heard? I'm sorry. I don't know what happened.
It was really, really short, Tim. I think if you pick up maybe just a sentence back would be good.
Okay, I was just saying, like, typically whenever whenever there's multiple collaborators within a project, you'll want to make any changes that you do specifically on either your own fork repository or within a separate branch. But obviously, eventually you do want to have those changes merged within or show up within that main branch, and you can do so by opening up a pull request. So I was struggling with the concept of a pull request, but I kind of think of it now as sort of the main repository or branch requesting to pull in the changes made in your separate branch or within that forked repository. Now, it is definitely possible to simply just open up a pull request, and this doesn't necessarily mean that you're automatically merging the contents. You're kind of simply opening up a connection, as it were, between your branch or your fork and that main repository. There's a couple of really neat features I feel like within GitHub. For example, GitHub Actions, which I won't dive into, but there are definitely ways in which GitHub will check and highlight any issues that there might be whenever you do try to merge the contents of the forked repository and the original repository or of specific branches. So in this example here, as I said, I forked that repository. I made a small change to the README file. So I opened up a pull request. Top right, you can see that that it should be able to merge. I want to merge my Tim Vanderstap /BDS primer best practices repository into the original repository. And essentially what that does is within the original repository, it shows up as one pull request having been opened up with the title, update README, and a brief description of the changes that I've made. So depending on the different permissions that are set within that specific repository, you might need somebody to review the changes that you've made, or potentially you might be able to just merge those contents as you please if there's no issues found. Final slide, please. So if you do run into any issues, or if you want to provide feedback, sorry, GitHub has a quite neat way of handling those. You can create like a ticket or what they call an issue within the repository. So within the primer best practices repository here, we have created several templates that you can use that are more specific to like whether or not you have questions or feedback or suggestions. And essentially really what it does when you create an issue, it opens up a thread where we can have an open and transparent discussion, and anybody can kind of read into the various arguments that people might have. And then whenever an issue is resolved, we can simply close the issue. But even closed issues, you can still kind of look through any closed issues over time if you want to. It is possible to kind of label, I guess, issues or tickets a little bit more clearly if you do want to kind of filter by them or search by them, as well as you can, if the issue or the question is specifically targeted at somebody, you can assign that specific issue to them by adding their GitHub handle to the issue. So hopefully that explains a couple of the very basic features that GitHub has. I think it'll become more clear as we kind of walk through a more practical demonstration. So I'd happily pass it on to Laura.
All right, let me share my screen real quick. All right, so this is the rendered GitHub repo into a website, the primer guidelines. The point, kind of what we're going for here in this session, is that we would like to get feedback on what we have on this webpage. So I'm just going to give a quick example of if you're looking through this content and you see something that you think needs to be updated or changed, how you might go about doing that. So say that you are here on our Make Your Data Internet Ready page, and you're reading through the content and you see, hey, how come OBIS has a link here, but GBIF doesn't? Maybe we should fix that. So we have these handy links here on the side where you can go to the GitHub repo, and you can also click this give feedback on this page. This will take you to the issues that Tim was talking about. For this question, for this issue that we found, we're going to go with the small problem template. You can also suggest new content if there's something you think is missing from these pages. But just for this example, we're going to use the small problem. We're going to give a quick title that describes what we think should be changed. Add GBIF link to make data internet ready. It has some questions in the issue template just to describe what you think needs to happen. So we'll just type in section 5, make your data internet ready. Should include a link to GBIF in the description. There is no link. Add the link is our suggested solution. So we're going to go ahead and create this issue. in the repo. Now you can see it within the repo. So say that we want to try to fix this issue instead of just putting in the issue and letting other people deal with it later. In that case, you can go to the repo by clicking here. This is the main branch, as Tim was talking about. One thing that I didn't cover is obviously you're going to need your own GitHub login. So you're going to have that set up first. To fork the repo, because you're not going to have access to make the edits directly into the main branch, you can go here and go to create a new fork. Because I've already worked on this before, I do have a fork. So for this purposes, we're just going to go there. And since we know that the change we want to make is here in this make your data internet ready markdown file, we're going to go there. And you can see this is the markdown of what is rendered into that web page that we just looked at. And so looking back at the page, you can see why should you know about them is sort of the header. And then we have this section, and that's where we want the new link to go. So we're going to go back and hit this little edit this file. And this is just how the markdown does links. Put it in brackets. Put in the link here. And we're going to commit those changes. And this is going to my repo. You can tell here because it's my fork. It doesn't say the ESIP repo right here. So we'll commit it. If you want to talk about what you did, you can put that here. You're like, we added the link to GBIF in the description. And it's kind of confusing because it will say commit directly to the main branch, but it's talking about my main branch of my fork. So go ahead and commit that. All right. And then when you go back, you can see that we are one commit ahead of the ESIP branch here. And let's say you want to go ahead and open a pull request to make those changes. Hit open pull request. And you can even link back to our issue. So if we go back to our issue, we had the number 40. So we're opening this pull request. We can say relates to issue number 40, and you can see how GitHub like pops it up and it knows kind of what you're talking about. That's one way to sort of link that this pull request is related to this issue and we're trying to make that change. So we will go ahead and create that pull request. And like Tim mentioned, GitHub does some checks to make sure, we're not breaking anything by making this change. And it puts that here. So I think the way the repo's set up that someone else has to approve my changes to make them active in the repo. Someone else can correct me if I'm wrong, Steve or someone. But yeah, that's the basics of what we're looking for in creating an issue, how to make some edits that are pretty minor, and submit a pull request to contribute to the repo. And I'm happy to take questions too, if anybody has any.
I just approved your pull request, so good to go.
Oh, cool. Okay, great. So yeah, so it's approved. If you go there now, you can see that the changes are made. So
That was great. Thank you, Laura. I just wanted to add in that with any pull request, you can kind of see there's a couple of tabs that open up, and one is where you can have a conversation with any contributors or project collaborators. But there's also a tab there where you can see exactly what files have been changed, and within each specific file, what exactly has been changed. So it has it shows like a before and after, as it were, which is great for review of these pull requests.
And then lastly, we'll have Steve lead us in an activity.
Okay, so this is both the fun and the selfish part. Selfish for us as a cluster, and also selfish for you as a scientist. What it is now is we're asking for your feedback on this document, the set of documents that we've been working on and developing for about 1.5 years now. So that's how we're being selfish. But you get to be selfish in that, like, you get to tell us what's wrong with everything and submit issues and pull requests and just go at it and then have a good time as a way to practice using GitHub. So, a part of this session was us trying to make sure that we were sharing with people that GitHub is not a scary place, that you can collaborate in that space and give feedback in a way that preserves the transparency of the process and opens it up to people working in different time zones and things like that. But then, of course, part of it too is improving these documents so that they'll be useful as well. I did want to come back to really quick. I had noted that Carl put in the notes document for this session. Let me get up here in the check-in. He had said, how can activities like this perhaps articulate with/leverage the work of groups like the Data Curation Network, especially their work in developing data primers? And that's a really good question, Carl. The Data Curation Network, we became aware of that work at some point, partway through our own work. And I would say first of all, it is a good idea. I think we're interested in having these works coalesce. But I think it's also what we've done here is create a cool example of how a group can collaboratively think through what are those best practices and what are the things that they, question their sort of norms or ideals about, like, how people should use data, in this case, biologists. I think we found in our discussions a lot of times we'd be like, oh, that's funny, Tim thinks of it this way and I think of it this other way, and Laura thinks of it as a third way, and then we'd sort of triangulate into something that made sense and what types of information we would like to share with our colleagues and peers. So I think that process is something that may or may not be part of how the Data Curation Network does something, but I think we learned a lot about how a community might be able to put together this information. And then the last part that sort of relates to that is, I think, one of our efforts in doing this through GitHub and doing having it be an HTML website that is rendered and people can give feedback on, and we can continue to iterate through it. That also serves as a base for people to fork it and go off and make their own custom versions. So let's imagine that, like, your lab or your institution or your project has a specific way of using a certain piece or a little sort of piece of advice that is like, hey, well, for our purposes, it's really handy to know that this is where that button is or something like that. You can fork it and then go off on your own sort of trajectory of development where it makes something that's useful for some other community. So I think that's an important part of this too, is like, this isn't like some final document. It's meant to be a base as much as anything else. But I don't know, Carl, if I totally, addressed what you were getting at. Do you have any thoughts in response to what I was saying?
Sure. And one of the reasons I raised it is that I've only really been engaged in the Data Curation Network for probably the last 1.5 years or so, and am still sort of figuring out, especially some of the sort of expanding and evolving norms around the collaborative development of their data primers. I'm right now in what I hope will be the final round of edits for the first primer that I've contributed to. So it's very much still a learning process. But one of the interesting dynamics that I've encountered is, while DCN uses GitHub, GitHub is not like the development locus for many of the primers. It's sort of working around the edges of GitHub, and that's been one of the hobby horses that I've picked up in my work with DCN so far, is trying to potentially start to expand DCN's use of GitHub for doing collaborative development of these, what are living documents. And that's certainly what brought me into the session today, is looking to see how our ESIP community has been approaching this problem, and especially around the challenges of learning and using GitHub for new users who come in with an expertise in particular data formats, in particular workflows, or even documentation standards. But GitHub itself, and I've encountered this in a number of different venues, it seems like it's going to be a really good tool to use, but then when you actually want the folks that you're working with to become comfortable and to actually use it, it's a significant challenge. And that's something that I've encountered in the DCN. That's something that I've encountered in previous activities. And so I'm curious how that learning curve and sort of spread of adoption of GitHub as a productive platform, how that dynamic worked out for this group, because I was just thinking how the exchange and the experience of this process could potentially provide a case study to bring to the DCN to help illustrate a more collaborative and shared version control approach to primer development than the DCN potentially uses at this point. They use it more to store and capture a limited number of issues by a limited number of users. But then also our community looking at the structure and content and the reusability of the primers that DCN has now developed quite a few of to help inform the interoperability and reusability of the work that we're doing here in ESIP in contributing to this set of primers that are being developed and maintained by the DCN. So I think there's opportunity to go back and forth, but the GitHub Nexus is what caught my attention in the immediate run up to this session.
Awesome. That's really great context, and good to know too that you're a solid connection to that DCN world, because I've never made any effort to get involved other than the website. I do see that Cassandra gave some great feedback in the chat about the different ways in which you can use GitHub and GitHub Pages for sharing things like textbooks, and included an example of how they manage covariance towers and the sensors to be able to check on them and do so without directly bugging Cassandra, which I think is for those of us. So to sort of address one of your questions, Carl, I think there are, for those of us who are pretty comfortable with it, and I would put myself in that sort of intermediate to advanced space. Like, I've never been a software developer, so there's a lot of workflow stuff that I'm not super knowledgeable about. But the basic idea of pushing information back and forth amongst a small group of people, that's something I'm pretty comfy with. And so I really like GitHub because I can follow these conversations and not lose it in my email, right? They have clear identifiers, and I know where to go get them, and then I can develop off that and give my feedback back to that. But there's definitely a lot of folks, and we've encountered this in our own cluster, who are still pretty wary of Git and GitHub, and understandably so. And I think so we certainly haven't totally cracked that nut, but one of the things we've seen is that within our group, as you sort of continue to give people simple tasks to solve, they're more likely to engage. And I think Laura's example of saying, "Hey, there should be a link here," that's the simplest type of feedback. Oftentimes, people feel like that type of feedback can be really insignificant, but I think it can be really valuable. So it's important to remind people of that. I'm trying to think if there was one other thing that I was going to say. Oh, right. And of course, too, there's also, there's certain realms in which you just can't use these things because of time or discomfort of users. I know within the government world, I would love it if the government used Git and, GitLab or GitHub to develop policy documents so you could see that transparent development. These days, it's mostly done in other types of collaborative editing, whether it's Google Docs or SharePoint or something like that. And totally, yet another platform. People definitely have fatigue. So if you're not always using it, it's it doesn't seem like there's a lot of efficiency to it. And in those cases, I think as a community, we try to sort of roll with that and be like, all right, that's fine. Just give me your feedback and I'll put it up there for you so the conversation can ensue from there. So I do want to pause for a minute and basically say this. I know, Adam, you just joined us, so I'm not sure if you caught the first part of this, but essentially what we're asking for is for folks to give feedback on, I'm going to put some links in the chat, give feedback on this document. Well, on the entire document, not just that page specifically. And that's going to happen via this GitHub repo. So if you're already comfortable if you're already comfortable with GitHub, have at it, jump in there, tell us what's working, what's wrong. Don't be afraid of raising any issue. We have been working on this for 1.5 years, and it's not because we're lazy. It's because a lot of these conversations, once you get into it, they get really nitty gritty. Is it important that we include that link? Is it not? Is that the best way to describe something? Are we being too technical, not technical enough? These guidelines are really meant to be an entry point for novice biological data managers to become familiar with data standards. So go ahead and get in there. We have another about 40 minutes of this session where you're welcome to just give feedback and give it freely. For the rest of us, or for people who aren't quite ready to jump in, I'm happy to show some more examples, but I want to pause for a second and see if anybody has any questions about anything they've seen so far, whether it's how to pull issues, if they need a sort of re-explanation of Git or GitHub, and also pull requests and cloning. We can get into that sort of more sophisticated side if people are into it. So I'm going to be quiet for a few seconds while to see if there's any questions. Okay, cool. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to continue to walk through some examples. If you feel like you're good to go and you want to start reviewing the documents, feel free to. Don't feel bad about not listening to what I'm saying. If there's anything that's confusing or sort of you want to take us on a tangent for a little bit, feel free to raise your hand. And if for my co-chairs and co-hosts, if you feel like I should be interrupted for any reason, please interrupt. This is really just about community development and feedback. This is not some crazy formal process. So what we're looking at here is the primer guidelines repo. First thing that might be a little bit confusing is that one of the first rabbit holes we went down is we had called this the best practices, and I think we spent about 2 months trying to figure out a better name for it because people really weren't keen on the name best practices. So we have extensive documentation of an eventual arrival at the name guidelines. So this will be updated eventually. But if you hear us go back and forth between guidelines and best practices, that's one reason why. One of the things that we didn't get to yet is within the issues. So if I click on issues, you can see all these. Now, I think it was Tim mentioned you can search these things, but let's imagine that there were thousands, which happens sometimes when you go to other GitHub repos, whether it's for some R package that you're interested in or some website that you want to give feedback on. So you can actually search right here. So let's see if there's anything related to the date. And indeed, there's an open issue saying syntax explanations for ISO 8601. So if I click on that, sorry, let me pause for a second. The reason I'm showing you that is because oftentimes that's a good idea. In this case, our repo is relatively small, so you may not have any reason to you can sort of browse and say, okay, yeah, nobody's talked about that yet. But this is a way of saying, gee, I wonder if anybody else has already raised that issue. And maybe you can just add to it. We put, let's see here. I guess I put, this was a while ago. I found an explanation from another resource, which had a very clear explanation of the syntax. And so we talked about adding this in to the material. So far, I don't believe that's happened. I don't know if any of my co-chairs can correct me on that. But sometimes it's helpful just to bump an issue, right? So you can go in there and just say, just checking in on this. Is anyone working on it? Let me see. Is it okay? Yeah, that makes sense. And then so I'll comment. And what that means is the person who created the issue, in this case me, would get pinged about that and say, oh, actually, no. So then one thing I could go and say, I can go up to, you can assign issues. So I could assign myself. I don't know if I'm allowed to assign. Yes, I can. How can I assign? Let's see if I can assign Kelsey to this one. Oh, there she is. Okay, cool. So Kelsey's going to get this one. And I can add a label to it too, like I think it was Laura mentioned. So labels, we can say, let's see, this is an enhancement. And so what that means now is Kelsey will also get pinged on it. And so she should see it in her email. There's other ways to check on these things within your sort of GitHub dashboard that's linked to your profile and that sort of stuff. But, you know, and if she doesn't see it, I can always hit her through other channels. I can email her, I can text her and say, hey, Kelsey, I don't know if you saw that, but I asked you to take care of this thing. Kelsey, so you know, we can talk about this. You don't have to worry about doing the specific issue. I'm just using it as an example. Okay, hit on every platform, right? So I'm going to ping her across all 14 platforms that we use on a daily basis. Anyways, so that's, so I want to be clear that, like, you know, so I want to, I guess, emphasize what, you know, Tim and Laura were saying, that like, this is really just like, this is a way to get feedback on a project. You don't need to be code savvy. You don't need to like be some whiz. You can just go to these things and offer your 2 cents, right? So if we go back to the issues, you know, we had small improvements to help with user friendliness. So this is something that that Tim added, and he actually made a checklist of a few different things. And so, for example, one of them is, I think we should consider numbering the subsections just to make sure the user, they make them more user friendly. So if I go over here, it looks like, so now I'm in the rendered version of this where we're looking at the HTML. It looks like we did do that actually, just it never got closed. So what I'm going to do is go back here, and it looks like actually I did some responding, but Tim never told me if it's cool. So what I'm going to say is, I'm going to say at Tim, if you're happy with this, go ahead and close the issue. And again, this is just about, it's just like the social aspects of collaboration. Nothing crazier than you already probably do in your email or in Slack or that type of stuff. What's different is we're doing it on this platform where it's a little more trackable and transparent. And then again, it allows you to work across time zones. So Tim lives on the West Coast of North America. I live down in the Gulf Coast. And so I might be eating dinner while he's still wrapping up his day. One
thing that I think you kind of highlighted, and everybody has different practices in this regard. What I've heard is one of my practices is that I tend to include many issues in one issue. That might not be the best practice for everybody. So for example, with this one, I would probably not close, even though I'm happy with the changes that have been made, I would probably not close this issue because there's still 2 outstanding checkboxes that would need to be ticked off, as it were. So it would probably be better practice to create a separate issue for each individual suggestion or comment that you might have. That way, that might make it a little bit more easy to track whether or not something's actually been done and whether or not that specific ticket can be closed, yes or no. That's clearly not something I've done here. So sorry, Steve.
That's okay. No. Again, and I think actually though, what Tim just explained is like an important part of that, remembering that this is just a tool to help keep you organized and keep you tracking your work. It's really not about, there's no perfect way to do everything. And on small projects, you might find yourself, you know, using more shortcuts, fewer commits, that sort of thing. And on bigger complex projects, you might find yourself sort of, you know, painstakingly tracking every little bit. And, you know, you have to find that sort of balance point with your collaborators. It doesn't have to be one way or the other.
And I'll also still add to that is there's no issue that's too small. Like if you see a minor typo, please just go ahead and you know, make that suggested change. Please contribute in any way that you'd like. Don't feel like that would be too insignificant of a thing to suggest and therefore not do it at all.
Perfect. Okay, so I do want to check something out that actually, it looks like Laura, maybe you already closed the issue, which is okay. So this filter is already on the search bar where you can say that it's an issue, but the state is open. So if we get rid of the state is open, we can also see the closed issues. And so this is the one that Laura had added before. So somebody had said before, even though issues close, you can still revisit them. If, let's say, you just want to learn from it, or you want to add a little reminder, oh yeah, this should have had this extra link, or here's how it's, even though it's closed, we're going to reference it in this new issue, that type of thing. And so I wanted to highlight a couple of things. First is, this was just the issue that Laura created, no big deal. She added, and then so you can now see that process going through it. So she said she added a label. She mentioned this in this pull request, and then you can see that she closed it as completed 19 minutes ago. So that's one of the ways that you can just see, again, sort of track your work backwards. And then on this one, I'm going to actually reopen it because I'm going to say, at Laura, did you forget to render the website before you did the PR? And what that's about is we're still trying to figure out our workflow for this exactly. For those who know about this, it's worth, I'll mention it, but I don't want to get into the weeds unless people are curious. There are sort of virtual computers you can leverage in GitHub to help render your code into things like websites. We aren't doing that right now, actually. The way that we started out, and this was, I think, just out of naivete, we started out rendering it locally and then pushing all that HTML to the repo. And so, for example, if we go back to the section that Laura had made that change on, let me show you here. You can see that GBIF still doesn't have a link. But Laura, you had added that link, correct? If I go back to the...
Yes.
Yeah. So if I go here to that pull request she made, we can see that under the commits, okay, getting there. We can see that here in this part that's highlighted green on line 11 was where the link was added. So what didn't happen here was it didn't get rendered into HTML. And so effectively what that means is if we go back to the repo, we can see that 25 minutes ago, that file was changed. But if we go into the rendered HTML, which is in the docs folder, again, this is a little more than some folks need to know. This file was not changed. It has not been changed since last week. And so I'm just showing this so going back to this issue that I reopened. This was just to make the point that you could reopen issues. It's not really important. We're still figuring out our workflow. It wasn't important to render it right now, but I wanted people to know that you can reopen issues if you have a desire to. That was maybe a little more sticky than I intended to be. Did that make sense? Okay, I'm seeing one thumbs up. Okay, cool. So let's go then. What the next? So now that I've shown issues, which I see as really being the main way that people will work with us. Again, sort of you can work your way. Use this as an opportunity to learn how to do pull requests. If you give us a pull request and something's not quite right, the worst thing that'll happen is we'll reject it and we'll write back to you and say, that doesn't quite work. We have to resolve this conflict where you made a change that gets rid of somebody else's revisions, that type of thing. But so feel free to use this as a practice space for learning those things. But otherwise, I want to walk through these sections a little bit and then again invite people to give feedback. And I think we can open it up for the last 15, 20 minutes where people can just be reviewing pages and giving feedback. So if we go to the intro page here, what you'll notice is it's a very sort of superficial introduction to this concept. Sorry, I'm switching over to the chat here. Tim asked, Steve, can you confirm that we don't anticipate people providing feedback, making changes to also have to render the web page? That's correct. And so what will change, I just didn't have time to change it over beforehand. We'll change it to a point where when there's any commit to the repo, it'll re-render the website using GitHub Actions, which is that sort of virtual computer I was describing. But even if they don't, like if just what happens is what Laura just did, that's totally fine, because now as a sort of key member of this, I could just, pull it to my own computer, render it, and push it back. Most likely I would have other changes to make too. But so that's not, I think I was mainly sharing that because so people could understand why they didn't immediately see those changes reflected in the rendered HTML. That's the main part. Okay, so this introductory material is really pretty light, and we're trying to this is the sort of value proposition for this whole project. Why are we doing what are we doing? What is it supposed to, like, how is it supposed to work? So especially, for example, Carl, if you have any feedback there, dots that should be connected or points that should be emphasized, we would love to hear it. This is where we're trying to introduce people to sort of why should they use this thing at all. Then the next 5 sections, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, are all directly correspond to sections of the primer. So this first one, providing context and understandability of your data, gives some overview to ecological metadata language, or EML, to ISO 19115, which is a metadata standard for geospatial data, for minimum information about any sequence or mixes, which is a sequence data standard. So things like, you could think of like genomics and metabarcoding and things like that. And then the next page is integrate your data with other data. And so here we give some overview to climate and forecast, which obviously there should be a lot of ESIP folks that are pretty familiar with that. For Darwin Core, which is a biological data standard that people may or may not be familiar with. And I think that's it on this page. This page definitely needs some work. For example, here is more or less a note where we left it after, I think, a certain meeting that we kind of acknowledged, hey, the Darwin Core archive is an important part of this. We need to flesh out some of that information. Similarly, we started this sort of list coming out of a meeting saying repositories that use this data standard, and we just have a couple pieces of text that could probably, use some links. So that would be another place where we could get some good feedback. Anyways, moving on, I'm going to show you another, by the way, all of this, this book is being rendered out of Quarto, which is, you can think of it as a more sophisticated markdown. I'm happy to talk about that, and anybody else could too, I'm sure, if people are interested in learning more about Quarto. Okay, but now, so on the bottom of page of section number 3, and I can also click to the next section down here, just pointing out that feature. And so now we're talking about taxonomic authorities. We spent a lot of time unraveling what taxonomic means to a biologist versus what it means to everybody else. And that was kind of an interesting hurdle that we didn't expect, where the biologists, we were like, well, it just means, you're talking about organisms and how you organize the organisms. And other people were like, oh, no, taxonomy is like organizing all information or any type of information and that sort of stuff. And it was a very valid conversation. In the end, we came back to sort of this assumption that, people are going to be pointed to this as biologists. And so we're just going to assume that that is there a little bit. But if you disagree, feel free to jump in there and give us some feedback in that respect. We had a little trouble defining this idea of taxonomic authorities, but I think it could probably still use some refinement. Those include things like Catalog of Life, ITIS, Paleobiology Database, and I think that, and WORMS, right? WORMS being the last one. So WORMS is the taxonomic database that's used by OBIS. Paleobiology Database, I actually don't know who uses it besides GBIF. Laura, is there any other huge users out there for the PBDB?
Paleontologists.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. And then ITIS is a USGS Smithsonian collaboration that has been used in the United States for a long time, that also feeds into the Catalog of Life, which seems to be becoming a bit of a front runner, at least in the biodiversity world. GBIF is moving towards Catalog of Life. the point is there's certainly more taxonomic databases out here than this. There might be real quirks about using them, so feel free to give us feedback there. Section 5, make your data internet ready. So this is the part that is probably a little bit of a stretch for a lot of biologists, thinking about, when you're sharing data on the internet, how does that information get to other people? And when you take information from the internet, how does that information get to you? So we started out, again, fairly naively and realized that we need to add a section here on application program interfaces or APIs. The people of us that are especially sort of NOAA NASA people immediately, recognize ERDAP as a significant service type, as well as Threads was another one, and then web map services. So this is, you can think of it as sort of GIS service through the internet. We then also started as a group, landed on the point where we said, oh, actually, we should talk about web-friendly standards, right? So there is I'm going to mess up this name, the W3C, which I can never remember what that stands for, the World Wide Web Standards. Is that what it is, I think? In any case, I think this is a place where we could probably use a lot more meat, a lot more sort of substance from our crowd. So please feel free to jump in there. And then I think, right. And then the very last thing, or no, there's two more maybe. We had schema wait, I missed it. DataCite, sorry. DataCite was interesting. At first, it got thrown in as a standard, and then we realized it was an organization that sort of utilizes standards. So again, there's sort of, I think this is a good example of how, as scientists, we were running into our conflation of different types of information, and conversing about them is a good place to start to unravel this. This is not unraveled yet. We're still working on it. Similarly, schema.org, lately I've been encountering this a lot with the Ocean Data Information System, but it's a really powerful way of sharing metadata across the internet. And I think something that more biologists should know about. Okay, and then the last section I want to highlight is this Make Your Data Software Ready. This was actually where we started, because this is when we talk about data as biologists, we tend to sort of focus on these nitty-gritty things. Oh, use CSV instead of Excel, is that type of thing. Are we talking about wide or long data, right? Are you like a tidyverse, fangirl, or are you I don't know what the wide version is of that, but again, things that we're fairly familiar with that we use because these are like the actual things we do with the data. Following ISO 8601 for dates. Right, this is such a sort of hilarious thing that there's actually like cartoons about it. That's how much trouble it gives us across the world. And then matching scientific names to taxonomic authorities. A lot of us sort of stop short of connecting we'll assign names to organisms and stop short of connecting them to the rest of the world and the sort of tree of life and that sort of stuff. And then also, recording space. Here we are offering this rather simple advice, recording latitude and longitude in decimal degrees in WGS 84. That is probably still, we realize is probably still pushing some biologists out of their comfort zone. But in general, we see this as a place where biologists could step their game up, right? Recording space more robustly. And I think that, in the context of ESIP, it's a really valid point. Earth scientists are thinking about this all the time. And as biologists, sometimes we can be a little lax. And I think, right, and the very last, is it the last one? Yes. The very last one is use persistent unique identifiers. These are coming more and more in vogue, of course. DOIs are pretty common these days. A lot of people know about them. ORCID identifiers are something that a lot of people know about. But the concept in general and applying it to your data in general is not something that a lot of biologists are used to. They're not necessarily thinking, hey, do I have an identifier for this, and how do I manage these identifiers? So again, these are what we see as like big chunks of information that should be important to convey to people who are new to managing biological data, and we would like your feedback on them. Okay, I think I have gone over everything I could possibly go over. We have about 20 minutes, 15 minutes left, and I would invite people to jump in there and spend some time giving us feedback. Is there any questions anybody has, or any conversation anybody would like to kick off, since we do have a few minutes left?
Hey, Steve.
Hey, other
So,
Steve. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How about you?
Doing well, thanks.
So I must confess, up to this point, I haven't really reviewed the document, but let me just ask this sort of proverbial dumb question. Do you define what you mean when you say biological data? Is there sort of just a definition of what the scope is for biological data? That's my question.
No, we have not been narrow in that. I think it's come from a place that is just from our own biases. For example, this group was started up by Abby Benson, Robert McGuinn, and Aaron Satterthwaite, and they all sort of came heavily from the obis GBIF world. So, that skew towards viewing the lens of thinking about biology as like a sort of stack of biodiversity evidence, I think is probably where it started. But if anything, we're becoming more general, and we're interested in becoming more general. I recently was at an ecological meeting related to an ecological network, and this idea of even standardizing space and time is like a hurdle that still exists. And so I think in that sense, it's pretty general to biology, but it might not necessarily apply to like biology done in a lab directly, right? Like if you're just doing experimental work in a wet lab, it might not be so applicable, other than sort of trying to say, here's where I got my source material from or whatnot. But I think modelers, for example, should be very aware of these, because the more that people are publishing data that is standardized and fair, the easier it will be to create models that move quickly. That's a little bit of my own opinion, but does any other co-chairs or members of the group have anything to add?
So hearing silence, let me just push back a tiny bit. I heard that at my own, such as it is, background is not dissimilar from what you just were talking about, Steve. I guess I'm kind of in a hazy sense thinking a bit more from the ecological perspective, maybe as an example. So like communities, for example, like plant communities, where obviously you see people trying to categorize plant communities and then characterize a particular places. This is the plant community that I'm seeing at this place. So it's, I guess you could oversimplify and say it's an assemblage of individual organisms, right? But they're also interacting in potentially extremely complex ways. So it's that's still falling within your intended scope of biological data, or is that a complication that which would be reasonable? Is that a complication that you want to say, no, we're not really dealing with that kind of more of an ecological perspective?
I think so. I'm going to put my opinion out there, and then other people can chime in. One of the strengths of this cluster and of ESIP is that we are a community that can go where we want to go. There's no top-down mandate of what we must think about. I'm interested in becoming more generally aware of how biology can interoperate across the subfields. So I'm not interested in saying no, like this doesn't work for that type of biology or anything like that. And similarly, it's I think a lot of this still makes a lot of sense for the geosciences or the the physical sciences and things like that also make up the ESIP world of earth science. I think that some of the little details in here might not make a lot of sense. For example, we describe I'm trying to think of an example. Well, we don't get too far into I think probably like our description of space, we probably tend to sort of be biased towards thinking of space as a point as opposed to like a polygon or something like that. But there's no reason that our advice couldn't work in that in a more polygon or regional scenario. Similarly, if you were working with a concept like a taxonomic concept, as opposed to something that is clearly like anchored in space or time, There's still worthwhile advice in here with respect to taxonomic authorities and respect to serving and sharing your data across the internet, as well as interacting with other data on the internet. So the short version, I guess, is that like I think this is still useful because my experience and my sort of, I guess, again, maybe my bias is that I think most biologists, regardless of what they study in school, are coming out largely unaware of how to create data that works with other people's data.
Yeah, totally. And I'm not asking the question trying to like promote a particular point of view. That it was genuine curiosity.
Oh yeah,
but yeah,
no.
I think it's an interesting question, and I know I don't know the answer to it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Steve, by the way, y'all, it's worth sharing that I recently started hanging out with Steve a little bit. We're going to have a session later this week on civic science on Friday. But it turns out that Steve, you're not with the EPA anymore, right? It was just that was
I retired from EPA. Right. Yeah.
So Steve was with the EPA for a long time, but he's actually one of the sort of progenitors of GBIF. He was one of the people that sort of helped kick things off the ground in the United States. So a lot of our work is based on a lot of his hard work. But yeah, Steve, I'm really excited. Hopefully you have an opportunity to continue to come to our cluster meetings. We have a lot of good conversations. A lot of times I, leave being like, I'm not sure. I thought I knew what I was talking about before, and now I need to go think some more, and I think that's like why we have these clusters. So even if it ends up being that these guidelines have a limited sort of audience after this, the collective experience we're going through, I think, is quite worthwhile.
Oh yeah, totally. What I didn't tell you, Steve, was way pre-GBIF, I was also involved, along with a lot of other people, in the creation of IDIS. And so we went through so much pain talking about taxonomic authority concepts and how the heck do you do this? And we started from almost ground zero. In fact, there was one guy who was building a database. He was literally reading textbooks, and he'd see, oh, that's a name I haven't seen before, and he'd just throw it into his database, without really doing any validation, as to whether it might potentially be valid or not. But the interagency effort to sort of create IDIS was fascinating, and this brings back a lot of memories from those days for sure. It's so important. I mean, it's super important, obviously.
I have a question for Carl. If you're still with us, I'm curious, now that you've sort of heard the longer version of the spiel, do you see ways that we could or should work with the DCN to, help each other out or try to coalesce in some way?
I think there are probably some opportunities. This is probably where my learning process with DCN and sort of where the points of entry are. Probably still needs to grow some, but I think there are some opportunities, especially when we look at the standards expertise that is embedded in the current primer that's been developed, and the benefits that expertise can bring into a number of the existing primers that DCN has developed, and a model that I'm working on trying to probably start a conversation about in the DCN around collections of primers. And this primer is a good illustration of one that is more cross-cutting than the more format-specific primers that DCN has focused on. And I've been doing this in the context of, starting the conversation in the context of geospatial data primers, as there are DCN primers on GeoTIFF and GeoJSON, and we're finishing one on shapefiles right now. And there are commonalities, and I think this is especially, highlighted really well in the primer that's been developed here, is looking at, biological data as a collection of as a discipline where there are a range of formats and standards, each of which in the DCN model would receive a deep dive. But there currently in DCN is not a sort of unifying, here's a collection of formats that address specific or primers that address specific formats. So I think that that's actually one potential opportunity for maybe as we start a conversation about how to possibly introduce this idea of primer collections. The experience in developing this biology primer could actually provide a point of connection of the expertise in the ESIP community to bring that to bear in a DCN conversation, and again, vice versa, in terms of thinking about and potentially conceptualizing this primer as and I think I'm hopefully not wrong in this, that this is more of that sort of collection level primer that addresses the set of formats and standards that are associated broadly with biological data. And so there could be sort of a convergence of models in a conversation with DCN. And I could certainly, as I said, I'm already starting a conversation with DCN as we're finishing this shapefiles primer on trying to bootstrap this collections thinking in DCN. And I think that could be a good opportunity that I'd be happy to, that offer a chance to engage with the ESIP group that's been developing this primer as an example of how to potentially envision a collection level primer as it can then reference the specific primers that represent the formats and standards that are referenced at the collection level.
Yeah, that's I like this idea. This is actually would be a pretty easy thing to do because we do this a lot throughout our guidelines where we say, hey, you want to know more about this? Follow this link. And so I think that makes a lot of sense. One of the things which we're still, I think, percolating on is who exactly is our user? Because I think we haven't, we've talked a lot about writing that section to try to say this is who we're intending to do this for, but we haven't done a great job of that yet, in part because we still are circling around it a little bit. We intentionally recognize the primer, meaning the document that these guidelines are based off of, as essentially a list, right? This is like the email you send where you're saying, here's a list of things, go check them out. And that can be really useful sometimes, but we also recognize that maybe there's times where somebody needs more than that, but they definitely don't need all of it. And so, a couple examples I tend to default to are like, the grad student who's out in the field for the first time, or, the IT person who is now being asked to manage biological data, which they've never done before. And so these are the sort of like the highest peaks where you're like, all right, make sure you're aware of this, make sure you're aware of that. As you continue in your journey, there will be reasons to do deep dives in these other things, but like, these are the things we feel inclined to make you aware of first. And I think if the better we get at understanding what we think that gap is of like people that could use this, I think the better all of these products will be.
Well, and on the potential audience front, that may be another benefit of potentially an engagement with DCN, because they are very explicitly focused on the community of, sort of the core of their target community are the data curators that are a part of the DCN, who are typically data librarians and other folks who are supporting researchers in the data curation process. So there is an explicit audience that DCN is engaged with, but to your point, having these primers available for use by or reference by early career researchers and others who find themselves working in labs or other venues where they may be taking on a data manager role or something like that, where having a short and straightforward point of entry for being able to ramp up their knowledge for what the options and recommendations are is really important. And the DCN primer material is a useful reference also for pointing to those folks that are sort of outside of the library data and data librarian community that where DCN started. Sort of similar to how the curricula that have been developed by the carpentries are a really useful point of reference, certainly for technical workshops for folks that are getting into data science or data management issues, but also as self-learning materials. But DCN can help potentially provide a linkage to that data curation support network that DCN fundamentally represents.
Yeah, absolutely. We are out of time pretty much, except Cassandra just put in this interesting note in the chat saying that she wants to create a data repositories list by category. Actually, she didn't say she wants to create, but she said, is there one? Cassandra, I think this is a bit of a sort of like a holy grail, right? Like we would like to get there. And yes, so if you have ideas of how we should do that and how we should add it, let's do it. But it is a lot of work. It's not going to say no, just going to say, you know, we need your leadership, basically. So I'll leave it at that.
And just one last plug before we leave, that our biological data standards cluster meets the first Thursday of every month, and I'll put a link in for everyone to join our Slack. So thank you.